Welcome back to Corona Chronicles, and last time we were thinking about Jesus calling his disciples to be about his work, to be with him, to preach, to have authority to drive out demons, and he chose very ordinary people to come and to be his family, if you like. And today we're going to be looking at another part of chapter 3, but this is what we would call a classic Mark's Gospel sandwich. In other words, there are two pieces of bread, and in the middle there's a really juicy filling. But because we're trying to keep the time short, we're going to look at just the bread, the verses before and after, and then we'll come back to the filling next week. So we're going to read verse 20 first. Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said he is out of his mind. And then verse 31. Then Jesus' mothers and brothers arrived, standing outside. They sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and brothers are looking for you." "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle round him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother."
Yeah, well, it certainly is a Mark sandwich, and just quickly to say that the meat in the middle, or the substance in the middle, is the religious leaders calling him a demon, a demonic man. But what you've got here is then you've got the mother and his family thinking he's out of his mind. It's quite an interesting expression, and they seem to think he's out of his mind because he hasn't eaten. And so there is real, genuine family concern here, and there's this great crowd gathering. Now, it's sort of typical mother, isn't it?
Yeah.
And siblings. It's like, well, you know, how's your brother getting on? Well, he hasn't eaten all day. Yeah. Well, you need some food in him. You know, it's like when you go home to your mum. Have you been eating your vegetables?
Yeah,
that sort of stuff. Yeah. But it's going a bit further than that, because they're saying, look, this is crazy way of living. You can't have all these crowds around you. And also they must have in their mind the fact that the religious leaders want to kill him.
Yes.
So he's disturbing people somehow.
Yes.
So is he claiming to make, are his claims too big? He's out of his mind. Let's get him home. Let's sort him out. Let's give him a good wholesome meal. Let's just relax him a bit, you know.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's part of it which just feels like natural concern, like as you say, the parents whose son or daughter has taken up a hobby and it's beginning to take over them. You know, they're spending all their time doing it. And yet there is a slight kind of clue here that what they're doing is actually not just concern, it is unhelpful for Jesus and his ministry. They went to take charge of him. You know, there's a sense in which they want to stage some kind of intervention, you know, and to remove him from his public ministry. And that is something which, as much as Jesus loved and honoured his family, he can't allow, because he's got to go on with the ministry. And you see that in the second half. So you've got Jesus' mother and brothers arrive, and then the crowd come in and say, well, your mother and brothers are outside looking for you, Jesus, you know. And then he says, verse 33, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And now the crowd must be saying, okay, he is out of his mind, because he now doesn't even know who they are. Yeah. He doesn't recognise them or understand that he's even got an earthly family, perhaps. But this is, you know, Jesus is not being rude or dismissive here, and he's not implying that those relationships don't matter to him. Like, who are they? You know, they don't matter to me. Because actually he was the perfect righteous son, and he would have honoured his father and mother and his family as part of his righteousness. But he's wanting to make a point, again, isn't he, about his ministry and who he is.
Yeah. It's actually probably worth saying, isn't it? Because a lot of Catholics have a very wrong idea of Mary. This is Mary. Yes. This is his mother. And she hasn't got everything right, and she needs teaching. But anyway, yeah, I think you're right. But he asked that question. He shows he is in his right mind, because he uses this as a teaching opportunity. And remember, he's teaching his disciples particularly, but he's also teaching all of us, obviously. And the question, "Who are my mother and brothers?" is asked, and then he looked at those seated in a circle around him, verse 34, and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." Mm. So he's taken this to say, I don't dismiss a physical family,
yes,
but there is a bigger and actually more important family that I've come for. Mm. And we saw that in the fact that people were coming from all over the world, all in different places, to gather around him, and that he creates a family where he teaches them, and they're with him. And it's a family that listens and sits at his feet, and he in many ways is the father of this family that he brings together as the family of God.
Yeah, and their unity is in their doing of the will of God, isn't it? So just as the Son of God does the will of the Father, so all of the adopted children, Christians, also do the will of the Father. And therefore our unity is in obedience, isn't it? And faith in God's word. And so that's really important, isn't it? Because there might be people, I suppose, who think, well, as long as I go to church and actually sit in the physical building, as long as I'm in the proximity of Jesus, I'm his follower. I'm in relationship with him. Or as long as I grew up in a house where there were Christian people, I myself am a Christian because I was in that kind of household. Yeah. But Jesus is saying, actually, it's not about physical proximity or where you happen to go on your weekends. What makes you my family is your trust in my Father's will and your doing of his will. That's where the unity begins and ends, isn't it? It's in faith and obedience. So that's a relational thing again, isn't it?
Yeah. And whoever does my Father's will, that sounds like, I've got to do lots of good works in order to get right with God. But his Father's will is that people would recognize who Jesus is. Because the Father's will is that we trust in Jesus and we look to him and see that we can't really provide anything. So it's a beautiful idea it's a family of grace, a family that is intimate. They're coming together. He calls them. We're with him. He teaches us. It really is a family. And the trouble is with the word church, at least in our country, we think of a building, sort of an austere building.
Which means in this lockdown we don't exist, presumably, because we can't.
Because you can't go to a building. Yeah. Well, but it isn't a building. It is people. It's people that have come around Jesus and listened to the will of God, and that's beautiful because he invites us to do that. Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there, and we'll see you next time.